Rudy,
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your background.
Uh, Born and raised in Southeast Los Angeles. In 1984, so it was a very like brown Latino, Latina, Latinx, not at that time, but primarily Latino community, working class peoples. I grew up in a place where the Firestone Tire Company and the General Motors Auto Mill factory had just closed down a couple years prior to me being born. My dad and my mom arrived in the late 70s. I was coming of age in the mid 90s at a time when like Prop 187 had passed in California, which was like the anti-immigrant, deny social services, any kind of human rights to undocumented immigrants. And so when I would go to school, I remember my mom telling me to speak only English in school so that I wouldn't be in like putting myself at risk. And then at home, I would speak Spanish with my parents. So it didn't end up passing. Prop 187 was like ruled unconstitutional, but that was a climate that I was coming up in Los Angeles, and that's the youth. But I grew up playing soccer. 1994 was also the year that I started to play soccer after the World Cup, and the World Cup was something I watched with my dad. And up until that point, I didn't even like soccer, but the World Cup does come with a fever, and you get it. You get the bug, and you just kind of like it. And it was in the U.S. It was hosted in the country, so up until that point, I loved boxing and I loved baseball. I actually wanted to play baseball, but 94, my dad graduates from adult school. He gets his GED, and then he says, I have time to take you to soccer or baseball practice now, so I could sign you up. And so we go to the park to get signed up, but baseball is like already halfway in its season. And so my dad's like, well, there's soccer signups that are like today's the last weekend that there's signups, and so it just happened to be serendipitously the sport that was available, and so I signed up for it. And I was like, well, I watched the World Cup, and so I ended up playing soccer, and then I ended up learning that I'm good at it, and so I never went back to sign up for baseball because I was just going to be a sports filler. I was like, I'll play soccer and then I'll sign up for baseball. But then I just realized I was good, and then I ended up playing competitively. I got recruited and played on some of the most competitive soccer teams in Southern California. Got a soccer scholarship, went to UC Irvine on a scholarship to play for the men's team there. And so sports has always been part of my life. And even when I was playing soccer in college, I was always watching boxing. And so, you know, 2003, 2004 was when I started undergrad. And then 2004 was when Facebook started to really make noise. And so I would use Facebook. I would write my predictions for upcoming matches. And so I started getting a following for that. And people started asking me my thoughts on fights. And then people who were betting money on fights would ask me who I thought was going to win, and so I kind of got a following like that in undergrad, and then in grad school when I went to Iowa State. But eventually, I started talking on ESPN in Spanish, the radio show in Seattle. My dad, I remember before I started the PhD program, my dad asked me, why don't I pursue a career in journalism and do sports journalism? And I remember telling my dad, boxing for me, writing about it, talking about it, it's just a hobby. It's just something I do for fun. But then when I got to my first year in grad school, working on my PhD, I was doing a study on like 16th century indigenous communities in Mexico and Christian hegemony. And I realized after the first quarter at UC Santa Barbara that shit wasn't going to sustain me. It was not going to be the most fun study to do. And that's when a light bulb like just like turned on in my head, and I was like, boxing is race, boxing is gender, boxing is politics, culture, all that, and boxing is policy, boxing is power dynamics, and boxing can help you tell a story, and that's why I have this firm belief that everybody in this world, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, has a story or some type of connection to boxing. And so in 2014 is when I really committed myself to creating an academic project around the sport of boxing, and particularly culture and politics, and how boxers perform resistance, rebellion, and present us with new understandings and new meanings of race, race making, and other identity politics.
What do you mean when you say boxers present us with new ways of thinking and then talking about race and practicing resistance. What do you mean by that?
Well, boxing is a different context from baseball, from hockey, from soccer, and so it's a different sport from those sports in relation to those sports, and it's a new, entirely new context and space. And so boxers have these unique opportunities that are to many fans ordinary. The ring entrance, for example, is a very ordinary, normal thing in boxing that everybody does. You walk from the locker room into the ring. Just a couple of those dynamics, and then you add that boxers select the music that they want to enter the ring to, or they select. Boxing is the only sport where you can dress up differently for every match or every game, or so it's like LeBron James or Kobe Bryant or Colin Kaepernick, even they wear the same uniform because it's a team sport, and they make their political statements in different ways. In boxing, you could use your fashion, you could use your ring trunks or your robe to make a statement. And so these are what we call expressive culture, music, fashion, style politics, and then the entourage or the community that you walk into the ring with. And so those are all things that are informed by your social location, by who you are, and so those are the reasons why I say that, like, there's new understandings of race and manhood and sexuality. So when I was talking to Robert the Ghost Guerrero, for example, he's a very vocal fighter who is God first. He also identifies as Chicano. And so when you think about Chicano identity, a very political, a very socially active, activist oriented political identity, that's one way of understanding Chicanidad and being Chicano. It also is an identity of being not from here or not from there. So it's not being from Latin America or Mexico, but it's not being accepted racially in the United States. So it's like a theory of hybridity as well. But for Robert Guerrero, he was like, I'm Chicano. And I think that disrupts the way that we think about Chicanidad, because we think about it as this progressive, radical identity. And sometimes people use how radical, quote unquote, you are to gauge how down you are, And so Robert, I thought, for me, was like, this presents a new way of understanding the idea of Chicanidad, or at least it presents a new conversation to happen. So the question is, can someone who is a devout Christian who supports the 700 Club, which is known to be a conservative Christian television network, does that make him less Chicano? Does that make him Chicano? Does that not make him Chicano? And of course, like, for me, it's not an either or. I'm more interested in talking and learning more about his experience. He has a farm worker's background. He is a worker. He is a working class person. And he used boxing as a way to make a better life for him and his family. And I think it also speaks to contradiction. It speaks to how we are as humans. Like, we might be radical in one area, but we're gonna be not as informed in other areas. And that's just the way people are. We're complicated.
Why use boxing as the medium to talk about race, power, oppression, masculinity? Why use boxing as a
Mhm.
mechanism to do that?
Well, boxing, a lot of people and a lot of boxing fans know this, is like boxing recruits from the margins of society. With the exception of Julio Cesar Chavez's son, Junior, which we always talk about. I mean, he grew up around a boxing family, and he grew up to an extent very privileged and with money. For the most part, boxers come from the barrios, the hoods, the ghettos, the margins, and mostly from like social class, but also like black and brown fighters primarily. Like, you ask any boxer, and they'll tell you stories of struggle, and so there's a boxer that I know. His name's Jonathan Wally, and he's a beautiful man. He's a cool, very insightful young man who I met, and the first time I met him, he had this shirt called, well, it said Black Lives Matter on it, and that was something I had never seen worn by a boxer. That was the first time I saw that, and so it got me thinking, why? And his answer was short and cool. It was like, because it's important. It matters to to acknowledge that black folks are being, killed at the hands of law enforcement. And he had a good answer. And then I sat with him again, and he said to me, okay, like, Black Lives Matter is a critique of all lives matter. It's like if you go to the doctor and you tell him my arm's broken, and the doctor says, okay, your arm's broken, but let's look at your foot. And Jonathan says, well, yeah, like all bones matter. They do. But if my arm is messed up, why are you going to look at my foot? And so what he was talking about was like the difference between a universal approach or an equal approach to societal ills with one of equity, which is like, it's not that because you're focusing on all black lives right now doesn't mean that you're disregarding other lives. It's just that there's an issue with race and racism in this country. And so to be radical about it, it's getting to the root of this problem, which has been historically a powerful ideological practice that has created hierarchies to keep some folks in positive light and privileged positions, and others in what Mortal Technique says, stay in your placism. Jonathan doesn't have a college background, doesn't have higher education, but he has this understanding from a lived experience that allows him to articulate something like Black Lives Matter in such a way that folks who go to college and get BAs and masters have been trying to understand, explain, and theorize, and and academically write about it. And this cat just sits down with me and tells me in a poetic and in a beautiful metaphor how he thinks all lives matter should be critiqued.
There's something that you said in that about Jonathan being this person who never went to college, doesn't have a master's, doesn't have a PhD. And as someone who's in a doctoral program, who spends a good amount of time around peers who are waist deep in, thick content, what is it that you think about the academy that sometimes can lead to academics, that bridge between academics and students, and using language that isn't as accessible? Does that make sense?
Yeah, like I think there's a difference between making, like, I don't think when you make something accessible, it's dumbing it down, and some people think it is, and I think that's just sometimes people say that when they have nothing else better to say about, if your shit is rigorous and if your shit is like if you could talk the academic talk, but then you're able to make it accessible for people who are not in academia, that's a skill. And I think for those that can't do that, sometimes we'll say that, well, that you're just dumbing down the material or it's not rigorous enough. And it's like, no, that's a skill to be able to make it accessible. It's not diminishing the work that you're doing. It's just making it, you're thinking creatively, and you're thinking, how is this going to be received by the people you want it to be received by? And so one way I try to make my work accessible through photography and storytelling. And so I've taken a bunch of pictures during my field work in the last 4 years, and now recently I've been framing them, I've been matting them, and I've been putting them out to share them. So photography is a way that allows me to share stories, humor, and like the entertaining aspects of the sport of boxing, especially for students who I know are boxing fans, is a way to get them interested and hooked. And then once I get them hooked, that's when I see an entry or an open window to begin to talk about rebellion, or how Jack Johnson relates to Muhammad Ali, and how Muhammad Ali relates to Mike Tyson, how Mike Tyson relates to Floyd Mayweather, or how Fernando Vargas teaches us how to be not an authentic Mexican, but how to be just authentic with yourself. In other words, presenting yourself in a dignified way, doing things on your terms, and not caring. Like Jim Carrey was the one that said, I think recently, and I'm sure someone else said it before him, but Jim Carrey was like, when you don't care about what people think of you, that's the most dangerous freedom you can have. And I think Fernando Vargas has always been that way, like unapologetic, does things with dignity. He's not trying to please anybody. And I think fans respond to that. And so, it allows me to talk about dignity and the politics of being unapologetic. And I think when you have a passion for something that you do, like I love boxing, and so it's a struggle sometimes because there are times where I'm like, boxing is a brutal sport. Like maybe we should do away with it. But then I take a step back and I see also how boxing can be a vehicle for, for people to get out of a certain situation in their lives. So, or boxing is a way that provides them a platform to speak out on water rights or anti-immigration positions that Donald Trump has, or to help raise scholarship money for students from farm worker backgrounds. And all these things that I just mentioned are the things that Jose Ramirez, a boxer from Avenal, California, does. And so boxing is like when Outcast, Andre 3000 said, they say that hip hop is all drugs and alcohol and violence, and he says, well, no, it's not, but it's that too. And so it's like boxing is a violent sport. Boxing is hyper masculine. Boxing is hyper heterosexual, but it's also all these opportunities too to look at how boxers claim beautiful moments of dignity and present new understandings of what it means to be a woman, for example, in a primarily men's sport. And boxing allows us to interrogate gender in that way, for example, right? So there's a little bit of everything. And then my challenge is to make it accessible, engaging, and fun for people.